Great. So welcome everyone, and thank you very much for joining our webinar today. The discussion will be all about the Delta variant, vaccines, boosters, and Dr. Ian Lipkin will be joining us in just a couple minutes here. I would encourage everyone to please use the Q&A box to ask any questions, and we'll try to get to them as the webinar proceeds. We already have a fair amount of questions that came in via email before the webinar. Our host today is Mr. Al Lewis, CEO of Quizzify, and as most of you probably know Al, he's one of the foremost authorities in wellness and population health. He's written a book specifically about wellness outcomes analysis, which studied corporate wellness programs and analyzed the outcomes and the validity of the outcomes and the ROIs. In addition to that, Al published a book in 2013 with Tom Emmerich, who managed benefits at Walmart for more than a decade. And in this book, Al and Tom wrote about centers of excellence, better pharmacy benefit management, better medical management. Many of these things Walmart pioneered, implemented before 2013, and that's what they talked about in the book. So Al is going to be our host today, and Dr. Lipkin, it looks like he's come in to join us. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Al Lewis.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. And I will just do a very quick shameless plug here, which is that after you see this, you may want to, actually have Quizzify come educate your employees, either as part of a mandate or in lieu of a mandate. One way or the other, we've got a full COVID curriculum. It carries the Harvard Medical School shield, and the updates to our Q&A happen almost in real time as more is learned. And we suspect that Dr. Lipkin is going to teach us some stuff today that will make it into the webinar. And so please ping us after the meeting to learn more. And with that, I will introduce you to Dr. Lipkin. And his resume, I don't know how many of you remember the old Rocky and Bullwinkle show, but at the end, Bullwinkle puts this, Rocky asks Bullwinkle if he has the credits, and Bullwinkle says he has them on this little card. And then the little card folds out into about 18 cards. It would take that long to describe Dr. Lipkin's resume, so I have a little crib sheet here that I'm going to read off. Dr. Ian Lipkin is director for the Center of Infection and Immunity at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. He is internationally recognized for his contributions to global public health through innovative methods that he developed for the diagnosis, surveillance, and discovery of infectious diseases. You name an outbreak in the last 20 years, and he was first or close to first on the scene, including Wuhan. In the New York Times, Dr. Fauci called him the quote unquote master virus hunter. Probably many of you saw the movie Contagion, which trended again when this pandemic started, because it kind of predicted the pandemic. In the movie, the world is confronted with a virus that jumps from animals to humans and shows how easy community transmission takes place and offers a glimpse into what vaccine development looks like. And speaking of movies, Ian also helped keep the 2021 Oscar ceremony safe. You didn't hear about any outbreaks there, and yet they were in person. He is a Quizzify's official go-to COVID guru, and also the official go-to COVID brother-in-law of Quizzify. And with that, I will turn the mic over to Dr. Lipkin to answer the many questions that have come in and are continuing to come in. And apologies if we can't get to yours. Ian, take it away.
Thank you very much, Al. My pleasure. So how do you want to do this? Do you want to read a question, then I'll try to address it? I guess you have something up here right now. Example of how sick are vaccinated people getting from the Delta variant? Well, let's start with that one then. So first, what is the Delta variant? The Delta variant is a type of virus variant of the COVID-19 associated SARS-CoV-2 that has modifications in the portion of the virus that attach to cells and allow it to get in. Tends to be stickier And so as a consequence, what happens is that a little bit goes a lot further than the other. So for example, if you are walking past somebody who is infected with Delta and they sneeze, this could be sufficient, even if it's a very transient walking past somebody in an air terminal, to convey this virus. It has now become the predominant virus that we're concerned about because it's spreading so much more rapidly. It seems to have different manifestations than some of the earlier infections. So Delta can be associated with very, very mild disease. It can actually look like an allergy. And this makes it even more diabolical, perhaps, because it means that if you sneeze or you cough or you even sing or talk loudly, that you may actually be carrying virus over to other people. But by and large, if you've been vaccinated and you get exposed to Delta, you are not going to have severe disease. There are always exceptions, but for the most part, that's a rule of thumb. The question, of course, is for how long you're protected if you've been vaccinated. And the answer there is we don't really know, because we haven't been vaccinating people for a long period of time. Most people have been vaccinated for only a few months. Some people have been vaccinated for 6 or 8 months. There is some evidence that if you've been vaccinated 6 or 8 months ago, that you'll begin to see a drop in antibody titers. This doesn't mean that you will become severely affected if you get infected with this virus, but you could, So this is the reason why people are beginning to talk about booster shots. Now, the booster shots that we have available right now are not specifically designed for Delta. They were designed for the original strains that were circulating in the early part of 2020. But they appeared nonetheless to provide some sort of an infection. If you were somebody who was infected early during the course of the outbreak, and you've also been vaccinated, there's some evidence now to suggest that you are better protected than if you just had the vaccines. Having said that, I don't want to encourage anybody to go out and deliberately become infected, because that can be very dangerous indeed.
Okay, well, we have just a zillion questions, and Mark, do you want to read off the ones that came in early, and then we'll go to the Q&A?
The first question is, what are Dr. Lipkin's thoughts on employers mandating employees to get vaccinated?
So I favor vaccine mandates. I realize that's a politically, challenging position to have. Nonetheless, I think that the only way out for us globally is if everyone is vaccinated who can be vaccinated. Now, there are people who cannot be vaccinated because they have an allergy to a component of the vaccines, or they have some sort of disease that might be aggravated by exposure to the vaccines. But even if, for example, you have some sort of a religious concern about exposure to something that might have been generated originally in some cell line that's a concern to you, fetal cell line or something like that, we have fully synthetic vaccines now, the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, for example, where that concern should not apply. So I'm really not aware of any religious exemption that would qualify in my mind as a good reason not to get it. There are some medical reasons not to. That aside, I think everyone should be vaccinated.
I think you actually already answered this one, but maybe you could just talk about it a little bit. If you had alpha,
yeah, I'm happy to expand on this, Al. So prior, even if you've had a prior infection, we still hold that you should be vaccinated. I was infected in March of 2020, and I have actually had 3 vaccines. I had all of them Pfizer. I had the prime, the booster and the booster more recently. In fact, just before I saw you, well, last weekend, I had that booster as well. So it's very important to get the vaccine as well, because it will reduce your risk of transmission to other people, and it will give you better protection yourself against having an adverse consequence of becoming infected. So infection alone is probably not sufficient. Now, what there is some discussion at present is whether or not, if you've had a prior infection, whether or not one dose of vaccine may suffice. And that's somewhat controversial. It's not clear yet.
Mark?
Another question here is, does a booster shot have to be from the same vaccine company?
So let me approach that two ways. If you listen to the regulatory agencies and the healthcare agencies and such, they will tell you that you should be consistent and stay with the original vaccine that you received. But there are exceptions to that. There was a recent study that was done in Germany where people looked at individuals who'd received the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is an adenovirus-based vaccine, and followed that with the Pfizer BioNTech. The rationale for doing that was that people were concerned about the observation that the adenovirus vaccines, particularly in younger women, were associated rarely, but to some extent, with cardiovascular problems, either thrombosis or something similar, some sort of platelet-related abnormality. And they wanted to get away from that potential with the second dose. So they shifted to using the BioNTech, and they found protection that was as good as the people that had 2 Pfizer BioNTech injections or 2 adenovirus injections. There may be some early data suggesting that there are advantages to being vaccinated with different vaccines that may give you broader immunoprotection than if you stick with one alone. And the one place where I'd say it's unequivocal that you should get a second vaccination with something different is if you receive the Sinopharm or the Sinovac vaccines. These are the vaccines that are based upon killed virus. They don't induce the same kind of immunity as you would typically see with the other vaccines that I've talked about. And I would suggest that if you receive the Sputnik vaccine, because that is not particularly associated with good levels of immunity, that you should follow that as well as one of the other vaccines.
You had mentioned the word adenovirus, which I think of being one in the nose and the mouth. And I recall you mentioning last week that the Delta variant was more up here, whereas the Alpha was more in the lungs. Did I get that right?
That's correct.
And
The
what does that mean?
the adenovirus vaccine that we're using right now is not given intranasally or orally. It is also given into the muscle. This is a very important point that I think in terms of arresting this pandemic. If we had vaccines that worked at mucosal surfaces where you first encounter the virus, like the nose or the mouth, we might be able to arrest transmission as well as prevent disease. So the intramuscular vaccines primarily focus on generating antibodies that circulate in your blood and in your tissues, not so much at the surface of the body. And that's really where we want to interdict the infection in the first place.
Is anybody going there now with a?
There are 110 vaccines that have been recognized by WHO. Of those, only 7 are focused on the nasal mucosa, and I think that this is unfortunate oversight, and it's something that that concerns me. And I've been trying to do what I can to encourage people to support the development of those vaccines as well.
Now, when we're talking about the nose and the mouth and adenovirus, we get into the highly politically charged area of masks. And I know we have a couple of mask questions. Mark, do you want to tee up the first one?
Yeah, there seems to be some controversy about masks and the Delta variant for vaccinated people. What are your thoughts, Dr. Lipkin, about masks and the Delta variant?
Well, the thing about the Delta variant is that, as I said earlier, a little bit goes a long way. So it's very important that you try to prevent any sort of virus from coming out. So, for example, this is a typical sort of mask that many people will be familiar with. This is, called a surgical mask. Some people have cloth masks. Here are a couple of other examples. This is a KN95 mask. Here's another mask. This one is not a KN95. This is an N95 mask. The KN95s and the N95 masks are much better at preventing virus from getting in or getting out than the surgical mask. And of course, it's important that if you're going to use these masks, that you wear them properly, because I frequently see people walking around with a mask that covers their mouth, but not their nose, for example. So it's really not doing what we expect it to do. With the emergence of the Delta variant, I'm seeing more and more people shifting to using the N95 and KN95 masks that are no longer in short supply as they were early in the pandemic. And particularly if you're going to be traveling or going through areas that are very, very crowded, this would be something that I would clearly recommend.
It has been stated that for exactly the reason you gave, that the surgical mask has been called quote unquote useless. I'm inferring that while not useless, it has some value, just nowhere near as much as the other.
So I think that anything you do is better. If you cough and sneeze into the crook of your elbow, that's better than, coughing out loud. And the cloth masks are better than no mask at all. And the surgical mask is better than the cloth mask. So I think people who say there's no value, are defeating themselves inappropriately. All I'm saying is that if you have access to these types of masks and you're going into a situation where you think you might encounter virus, right? It's likely that you'll encounter virus. This is a good idea. And if you don't have access to this one and you don't have access to this one, then this is a good alternative. I mean, whatever you can do. I mean, I've got a whole mask collection here. Here's another one, So, this one's a little better color coded. So if you're going to a formal event, you might want to wear a black mask, black mask party, something like that. So there are, I wouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater.
All right. Well, we've got just a zillion coming in here. Mark, anything else you want to read?
We've got another one here that regarding if you're vaccinated and you think you might still have got COVID, and the importance of getting tested, and then if you are positive, getting treated immediately. Is it important that if you do get COVID one way or the other right now, to get treatment immediately? Does that help in the recovery, and is that something people should be aware of?
Well, I wish there were a good treatment that I could recommend for you. We don't really have good drugs as yet. There are monoclonal antibodies that some people recommend. However, they're beginning to lose their efficacy as we're seeing more and more mutations. The nature of monoclonal antibodies is that they have a very small target on the virus that they attack. And if that shifts in some way, they no longer have much in the way of efficacy. The reason to be tested primarily is so that you can make certain that so that you take perhaps more precautions in not infecting other people. So you would isolate yourself. That's the major advantage.
Mm-hmm. So what we're on the subject of the monoclonal antibodies and the Delta, are you predicting that there's going to be another variant like Lambda or something that's going to take over? Or
Oh, I would not surprise me if we ran out of letters, Al.
Really?
Oh, goodness.
This virus is not going to disappear completely. Now, the question, of course, is you know, how much disease they will cause, how transmissible they'll be. But Lambda is something that many people are concerned about right now. I'm not as concerned about Lambda as I am about Delta, but we are monitoring Lambda and others as well very, very closely.
Okay, so back to the Q&A. We have 2 employees who are testing positive again and again after quarantine. They don't have symptoms. One is vaccinated, the other isn't. What is your guidance on how to handle recurring positive testing without symptoms?
So there are 2 ways of looking at this. One is if you have the ability to get quantitative information and you can demonstrate that the amount of signal when they do a PCR assay is decreasing, that tells you, particularly if it's beyond a certain threshold, and I don't want to get into minutia here, but there are cycling thresholds which we consider not to be associated with infectivity. And if you're doing this correctly, I can say that this individual has little remnants, fossilized remnants of the virus, but is not infectious. But that's something that requires a more granular kind of discussion. So the people you have working with you, I would hope, would have access to that kind of information so they could say that the level is so low that it's not going to be associated with infectious virus. Because it can take a very long time for somebody to become stone cold negative.
And that actually brings up another question that's somewhere on the list, which is after you've had the disease, some people say you need to wait 90 days to get a vaccine. Is that?
No, I don't think that's necessary. I think what people are talking about there, well, there are 2 issues. One is that the vaccine is in short supply, or was in short supply at one point. So we knew that there was a certain amount of protection that people had after they were initially infected. But the other aspect of this is that if you have a lot of antibodies directed against this virus already, then the immunization might not be as effective as after those antibodies have begun to wane. So that's the reason. So there were sort of 2 reasons that people were saying you shouldn't get vaccinated within that 90-day period. So at this point, I would think that's still a good rule of thumb to follow. But if you cut it to 60 days, that would be okay too. I mean, what we need to do is to make sure that people don't assume that because they've been infected, that they will never become reinfected. There is evidence that if you've been infected, you're less likely to become infected, but it's not 100% foolproof. And if you get that immunization on top of the infection, your level of protection goes up dramatically, not only against the original strain of virus against which the vaccine was made, but also against some of the new variants that we're seeing, like Delta.
Mark, do you want to do one from the?
Yeah, as a follow-up to that, is there any data yet on people who have contracted people who contracted COVID last year being reinfected with the Delta variant this year?
Yes, there are people who become reinfected.
But
there haven't been many people who are infected with the original virus who've had severe disease. Those are very, very few. But reinfection with, a cough and a cold-like symptoms, that sort of thing, have been reported. And much, much less frequent we have people with severe disease. So there is some protection associated with infection with the earlier strains.
Yeah, we had seen those numbers from the Cleveland Clinic from January to the middle of April. There were 99.7% of the people that were hospitalized were not vaccinated. Have those numbers changed at all recently because of the impact of the Delta variant?
No, the Delta variant is still primarily infecting people who've not been vaccinated.
And there appears, on that point, it appears that the people who are getting severe disease after being vaccinated had obesity or some comorbidity that goes with it. Is that accurate?
Not always. Anybody who has some sort of underlying medical condition that interferes with their, respiration, whether it's COPD or emphysema or, morbid obesity or diabetes, a wide range of things actually, or congestive heart failure is at much, much higher risk for being infected. And these are people who must be immunized. And I think that the sort of the guidelines for immunizing people who are immunodeficient should have included people who have some of these underlying conditions that are not necessarily restricted to people with things like HIV, AIDS, or primary immunodeficiencies.
Mark?
Another question here is, why has there been such a big surge in outbreaks in the summer when typically other viruses are less active, especially in light of the increase in vaccinations?
That is a very good question. I think what's happened is that people have become somewhat complacent about protecting themselves and protecting others. There was an assumption made that because people were being vaccinated, that they could let their guards down and get into situations which are much more intimate. This is what happened in Provincetown, Mass. You had these large indoor gatherings, people drink, they wind up, getting much, much closer to one another. And as a consequence, Delta, which is very, very infectious, was able to really take off.
Mark, do you have one? Because
we've seen a fair amount of questioning about children going back to school and all that and being vaccinated. And the question, what is the reason to vaccinate children if the vaccine reduction in transmission is only 40 to 70% range for Delta? Combine that with the fact that vaccine trials were not done on children. So how can we know the benefits outweigh the potential risks?
We've been vaccinating children against a wide range of infectious illnesses, infectious diseases for many, many years. We've got measles, mumps, rubella, tetanus, polio, smallpox, and so on. I don't see any reason to think that the coronavirus vaccine is going to be capable of causing any more damage than those have done. And we do know that children who become infected with this virus can have very severe disease. Now, if you're correct in saying, or whoever it was who's asked this question is saying that we don't yet have good data on children under the age of 12, but I expect that we probably will. When we do, I imagine this is going to show that the virus-associated disease is much less marked in kids who get vaccinated. Now, Delta is not as good a target as some of the earlier strains of the virus that have been circulating. That's true. But even if it's not a great target, when you look at the number of people who develop severe disease with Delta, they're much, much less if those individuals have been vaccinated or have had a previous infection with a virus that preceded Delta. So those two things, together suggest that there's every reason to get children vaccinated as soon as those vaccines are approved. And as long as we're talking about this, I should add, the youngest children of all, right, the fetus. The evidence suggests that, women who are vaccinated while pregnant are not at any higher risk of having stillbirth or obvious developmental abnormalities in these children. And in fact, the infant is probably protected by maternal antibodies as a consequence of having had this vaccination occur during pregnancy. So we are also encouraging women who are pregnant to have vaccines because the disease is much, much worse.
If you're pregnant.
Well, I'm just saying there's nothing that I've seen thus far that suggests that it's better to be infected with SARS-CoV-2 during pregnancy than to have a SARS-CoV-2 vaccine.
In general, it would seem like whatever the hazards are of the vaccine, they are overwhelmed by the hazards times the probabilities of getting the disease.
Well put.
Yeah, people tend to focus on, I think, the items that make the news. And speaking of the news, another burning question is, and I think I probably know what you're going to say, but I'd rather have you say it than me. Did this originate in a lab?
You know, Al, I've written extensively on this now. It's not a simple answer. So is there any evidence that it originated in a lab? No. Is there any evidence that it originated in nature? Not really. All we know is that it originated, and it's plausible, more plausible that it originated in a wildlife market or a wildlife farm, because that's where so many of these other agents have originated, than that it originated in the lab. The one thing we can say with some certainty is that it was not designed in a lab. And the reason is that there is no blueprint that we had prior to the advent of this pandemic that would have said, aha, if I want to make a really bad virus, this is the blueprint. We didn't have such a blueprint. I certainly didn't have it, and I do this for a living, trying to figure out how viruses cause disease. So there's no evidence that it was deliberately created at WIV. Now, is it possible that somebody in the process of collecting bats or animals or something like this in a wildlife market or in the wild somehow was also somebody who worked in a laboratory? I can't exclude that as a formal possibility, right? And so the report that came out a few days ago, the Biden request, the 90-day turnaround from the intelligence community said that, most people who were consulted felt it was more likely to originate on a wildlife farm or in a wildlife market than in a laboratory, but they couldn't entirely exclude the possibility that there had been some sort of inadvertent passage through a laboratory. But there's no evidence to support that. And I don't actually think that any such evidence ever existed that could have been used to settle this once and for all. And it doesn't make a lot of difference at this point. I mean, what we know is that wildlife markets, wildlife farms are dangerous and they shouldn't be allowed. And anybody working with potentially dangerous samples that could cause disease in humans should be studying them under rigorous biocontainment. So these are changes that we need to make in terms of the way we do science, animal husbandry, hunting, and so forth.
So I'll give you a chance for a little shameless plug here. I believe you were talking about wildlife farms and trying to shut them down as many as 10 years ago.
More than that.
Okay.
So, I was in my second residency doing neurology at UC San Francisco when HIV emerged. And when we began looking at that virus, it became clear that it had originated in non-human primates. You then ask yourself, well, how did it get from non-human primates into people? Well, it was bushmeat hunting. So that's the 80s. And then we had
Screen froze here.
originated in wildlife. Many of them have also trafficked through domestic animals where they get amplified and better adapt. So yes, wildlife or an.
And I do recall in the movie Contagion, that was exactly what happened in a kitchen. Somebody took a boar, I think it was, and that's how it transmitted to the cook or something like that, right?
Well, I went to the cook, and from there to Gwyneth Paltrow.
Right.
She doesn't reference that in Google, but maybe she should.
So we have about 10 minutes, and we've got quite a number more questions, and we apologize if we can't get to them all. Mark, is there a particular topic that hasn't been covered there, or should I go to the Q&A?
Well, getting back to employer groups, another question that came in here is, Dr. Lipkin, what recommendations would you make for frequency of testing for employers who are testing either vaccinations, who are requiring people that aren't vaccinated to be tested at certain intervals?
So I can tell you what we're doing in the film industry and in show business in general, and what we're doing in universities. So universities are testing a random sample, at least Columbia is, on a continual basis, so that we have some sense as to what's circulating in our communities. We're also testing sewage, because this is a way of looking at a large number of people simultaneously, because if they spit or what have you, you wind up seeing evidence of infection. This allows you to track what's happening on a larger population level. In the film industry, what we're doing, and those people who work in close contact with one another, those individuals are being tested on a daily basis. Now, I don't think that that's something that's feasible for many industries. I think that testing once a week at minimum, perhaps every other day, is something that many industries are moving toward if there's a lot of risk. The other thing that we're doing is we're trying to find ways in which we can reduce the frequency of testing by shifting to once a week if everyone has been vaccinated. But if that doesn't pertain, if you don't have a situation where everyone is vaccinated, then you have to test more frequently.
Mark, anything else
And,
specific
yeah.
to employers in there?
Well, and this would apply to some degree. When boosters become formally recommended, do you anticipate a shortage in supply and delays in the general public getting the booster? Or do you anticipate the process? Go ahead.
I don't actually. I think that manufacturing has come up to speed, and I think we're going to be able to provide whatever it is we need at the time that they begin to be released for individuals who are, 8 months out, or maybe 6 months out, depending on how it eventually rolls out in the latter part of the fall. Right now, we're talking about 8 months, but it would not surprise me if it moved down to 6. But it's not like the early days where we were talking about how do we prove the vaccine for safety and efficacy in the first place. These are modifications that are more minor. Now, as we begin to roll out vaccines that are designed to target some of the new variants, that may shift a bit, but probably not much.
So one of the things we haven't talked about, and we only have a few minutes left here, is long COVID. The risk of long COVID to vaccinated individuals versus non.
Well, long COVID is a term that means different things to different people. So all that we're really talking about there is individuals who have sequelae of an infection with SARS-CoV-2. Now, to some extent, you can have organ damage to your lungs or to your brain or your kidneys, what have you. That is not typically what I like to think about as long COVID. That's something that's much more understandable in terms of the immediate consequences of disease. But there are a group of people who have a very poorly understood syndrome that looks very similar in some respects to what we know as myalgic encephalomyelitis chronic fatigue syndrome, ME/CFS, where they have difficulty with cognition, what they call brain fog. They have fatigue that's not relieved by rest. They may have problems with their autonomic nervous system, so if they stand up, they get lightheaded, things of this nature. We don't really understand long COVID yet. And the National Institutes of Health has started a large program to try to identify, biomarkers for figuring out who has that disorder and what the appropriate therapies might be. But I think it's still too early days for me to say anything, substantive on that topic.
And your lab has expertise in that particular area anyway, if memory serves.
We do, and I wrote an article which I can share with your readers with one of your colleagues at Harvard on this very topic. And we argued about whether or not the article should be blue or red.
Actually, blue or crimson, I believe that would be. Mark, we have time for about 2 more. Do you want to pick your favorite ones up?
Well, here's a general question about herd immunity. When you consider the unvaccinated people who did get COVID and the vaccinated people and people are contracting Delta now, what can be said about the path to herd immunity and the relevance of that?
Well, I think all of those individuals will contribute to the overall sum, which comprises herd immunity. What we haven't talked about is, maybe a relative term in terms of herd immunity. And again, with Delta, if people become infected but have only mild disease, that's not going to be a major issue. Many coronaviruses are associated with mild disease. We encounter them as children. We slough them off without severe disease. My prediction is when all of this is said and done, and people are vaccinated, and this virus had worked its way through the world's population, that we will continue to see a certain number of deaths associated with this coronavirus and related coronaviruses on an annual basis. But our hope is that it's going to look more like influenza, where, it's 30,000, 40,000 people a year who die of flu. We feel terribly about the fact that this happens, but it won't be like, hundreds of thousands or millions of people will become infected and die, which is what we're confronting now. And it certainly won't cripple, the economy the way it has.
You've been quite consistent in saying that, ever since you started talking about it, and saying that you thought it'd be mid-2022 before true normalcy returned. Is that still your estimate?
I would say near normalcy. I wouldn't call it true normalcy because, again, as I said, we're going to continue to see outbreaks. You're going to continue to see deaths associated with coronaviruses, but it's not going to be incapacitating the way it is now. But all that is predicated on people doing the right thing and getting vaccinated.
Mark, do you want to wrap up with your favorite remaining questions there?
Well, this relates to some of our employers that might be considering, ways to keep their offices safe. Is there anything new on the air purification front in terms of systems that you may have heard of that employers are using or are deploying within their offices?
So this is a very good point because the virus is airborne. And, the most important thing that we can do, of course, is to improve ventilation to eliminate, or reduce at least the amount of virus that's circulating through the air. So what can we do? Obviously, in the summer months, we can increase the amount of outside air, which is what everyone is doing. But as we begin moving into the colder months, people are not going to want to do that. So the only thing that one can use really at present are various HEPA filtration systems, though there are others who are trying to circulate air past ultraviolet light. And there are people with expertise in this area, engineers who specialize in it. We use them for the Democratic National Convention and for the Oscars and elsewhere. But that's not the kind of thing that I could, talk about in 2 minutes.
Okay, well, speaking of 2 minutes, we are basically out of time. We just have enough time to thank you very much for your participation. And as usual, I shouldn't say as usual, the second time we've done it, for the second time in a row, I think you absolutely hit it out of the park. And we're just very grateful to have you on. And thank you very much. And as for the rest of you, thank you for joining and the great questions. And make sure to follow up with us if you want some COVID material for your employees, which I think we're going to be doing a little bit of revision on now. So once again, thanks to everybody, especially our guest. And we'll talk to you at the next webinar.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Lipkin. Thank you.
Sure. Bye-bye.